The New Jersey militiaman who wouldn't stay down was caught in British bayonet assault during chaotic fighting at Brooklyn Heights in August 1776, when British forces overran American defensive positions through coordinated attack combining flanking maneuver with frontal assault that shattered continental lines. He takes multiple wounds from British bayonets as redcoats swept through American positions, their edged weapons more effective than muskets in close-quarters combat, where reloading was impossible and where steel determined survival. Still fights back despite wounds that should have incapacitated him, using musket as club, when bayonet charges left no time for firing, and when hand-to-hand combat became struggle for survival rather than organized military action. His resistance surprised British soldiers who expected wounded Americans to surrender or collapse, rather than continuing to fight after receiving injuries that typically ended soldiers' capacity for combat. Multiple wounds accumulated as he fought through British assault, each bayonet thrust, creating injury that should have stopped his resistance, but that somehow failed to prevent him from continuing to struggle against attackers who kept coming through smoke and chaos of collapsing American defensive line. British soldiers recorded their surprise at facing wounded American who refused to fall despite receiving wounds that normally ended combatants' ability to resist. Caught in assault that was killing and capturing hundreds of Americans, militiaman's survival seemed impossible to British, who witnessed his continued resistance after wounds that should have been fatal, or at least incapacitating. His refusal to stay down became part of British accounts of Brooklyn Heights fighting, officers noting with mixture of admiration and puzzlement the American soldier who kept fighting after taking multiple bayonet wounds that would have killed most men, or at least ended their capacity for resistance against professional soldiers whose training emphasized finishing wounded enemies to prevent them from shooting British troops in back during advance. The miracle escape at Long Island occurred when wounded militiaman somehow withdrew from battlefield despite injuries that should have prevented movement, making his way through British lines during confusion following American defeat. British officers record his survival in their accounts of battle, noting with disbelief that soldier they had seen wounded multiple times during bayonet assault had somehow escaped capture or death that seemed certain for anyone receiving such injuries during close combat. Calling him unnaturally immune to steel because his survival contradicted their combat experience, where soldiers receiving multiple bayonet wounds died from blood loss, shock, or infection, even if wounds individually were not immediately fatal. His escape seemed impossible to British who had witnessed his wounding and who assumed he would be among casualties collected after battle, making his absence from captured or dead Americans notable enough to mention in officers' accounts. British disbelief reflected their professional military experience, where wounded soldiers typically could not escape from battlefield without assistance, making militiaman's solo withdrawal through British-controlled territory seem nearly miraculous to observers who understood how difficult movement was for severely wounded men. Their accounts described him as having supernatural protection because natural explanations for his survival, luck, adrenaline, determination seemed inadequate to explain escape that defied their expectations. Record survival in official accounts and in personal letters where British officers discussed remarkable incidents from Brooklyn Heights fighting, the wounded militiaman's escape becoming example of American determination that British found both impressive and frustrating. His survival demonstrated that some Americans would continue fighting and would find ways to survive despite wounds and circumstances that should have ended their resistance, creating persistent problem for British, who discovered that defeating Americans in battle did not always mean eliminating them as threats, when wounded soldiers could survive and return to fight again. The Pennsylvania frontier sniper was backwoods marksman, whose long rifle and hunting experience made him deadly threat to British forces, unaccustomed to facing accurate aimed fire at ranges where muskets were ineffective. Armed with long rifle that frontier craftsmen had developed for hunting game in Pennsylvania's forests, he possessed weapon, capable of accurate fire at distances exceeding 200 yards compared to muskets, whose effective range was under 100 yards, and whose smooth bores made them inherently inaccurate beyond close range. Unmatched accuracy resulted from years of hunting, where missing shots meant going hungry, creating skill level that British soldiers, whose training emphasized volley fire rather than individual marksmanship, could not match even if their weapons had been capable of accuracy that riflemen's long gun provided. His frontier background taught him to shoot from concealed positions, to estimate range accurately, to account for wind and other factors affecting bullet trajectory, and to remain motionless for long periods, waiting for clear shots at valuable targets. A backwoods marksman represented new type of soldier that British military experience had not prepared them to counter effectively, his individual lethality exceeding what European military doctrine considered possible for single infantrymen, whose role in conventional warfare was firing as part of coordinated volleys rather than seeking specific targets for aimed shots. Frontier snipers like Pennsylvania riflemen exploited American terrain and tactical advantages while avoiding close-range combat, where British numerical superiority and bayonets would have negated riflemen's advantages in long-range accuracy. With long rifle that made him dangerous at distances where British could not return effective fire, Pennsylvania sniper embodied American adaptation of European military technology to New World circumstances, where hunting skills and individual marksmanship mattered more than formation discipline that European armies emphasized. His effectiveness against British forces demonstrated that American soldiers could exploit tactical niches where their advantages in woodcraft and marksmanship compensated for disadvantages in training, equipment, and numbers that conventional battles typically revealed when Americans faced British regulars in open combat. The shot that shocked Howe's officers occurred when Pennsylvania riflemen engaged British scouting party at range, where British assumed they were safe from American fire. His accurate shooting at distances exceeding British muskets' effective range, creating casualties among scouts who had not anticipated facing lethal fire from concealed American position. He disables entire scouting party through systematic shooting that killed or wounded each British soldier before survivors could locate his position or close distance to where their muskets could return. Effective fire against sniper, whose concealment and range advantage made him nearly invulnerable to British response. Through picking off British scouts one by one from hidden position that British could not identify quickly enough to organize effective response before riflemen had eliminated most of scouting party, his tactical approach demonstrated how single skilled marksman could neutralize British unit through exploiting advantages in range and concealment, escapes untouched by withdrawing before British reinforcements could arrive or before surviving scouts could organize pursuit. His knowledge of terrain allowing him to disappear into forest where British forces were reluctant to pursue riflemen who had already demonstrated his lethality. British officers' shock at losing entire scouting party to single American riflemen reflected their unfamiliarity with frontier warfare, where individual marksmanship and forest concealment created tactical situations that European military experience had not prepared them to handle effectively. Their accounts described incident as demonstration of American tactical innovation that British conventional military training had not equipped them to counter, making frontier riflemen disproportionately effective against British forces, whose tactical doctrine assumed enemies would fight in formations where numerical superiority and coordinated volleys determined outcomes. Howe's officers noted riflemen's escape as particularly frustrating aspect of engagement, where American had killed or wounded entire British scouting party, then withdrew successfully despite British attempts to pursue and eliminate threat he represented to future reconnaissance operations. His survival and escape demonstrated that British could not easily counter frontier snipers, whose hit-and-run tactics exploited terrain advantages and superior marksmanship to inflict casualties while avoiding direct confrontation, where British professional advantages would have made riflemen's capture or death likely outcome. The New England corporal, with perfect luck, marches across open field under full British volley fire during engagement, where American forces were advancing toward British positions that defenders were supposed to protect through coordinated musket volleys that normally devastated attacking infantry crossing open ground. Under British volley that should have killed or wounded significant percentage of attacking Americans, Corporal walks through fire that was dropping soldiers around him, but that somehow missed him despite his exposure to hundreds of muskets firing simultaneously at American formation. Across open field, offering no cover from British defensive fire, his march continued as comrades fell wounded or dead, while he remained untouched by musket balls that were filling air around advancing American line. Full British volley fired, according to standard defensive doctrine, should have created casualties throughout American formation, including Corporal, whose survival seemed miraculous to witnesses who saw soldiers falling around him while he latinged, continued advancing as if British fire could not touch him. His perfect luck, or inexplicable survival, created impression among both Americans and British that he possessed supernatural protection, because laws of probability suggested that someone advancing through volley fire should have been hit by at least one musket ball from hundreds fired at American formation. Marches with confidence that British observers interpreted as evidence of divine protection or unnatural immunity, rather than as extraordinary luck that allowed him to pass through lethal fire zone without receiving single wound from volley that killed or wounded dozens of his fellow soldiers. Under full volley, whose effectiveness against massed infantry formations was proven military principle, Corporal's survival contradicted expectations about casualties that defensive fire should have inflicted on attacking force crossing open ground. His untouched passage through British fire became notable enough that both American and British accounts mentioned New England soldier who walked through volley fire as if musket balls could not strike him, creating legend about Corporal, whose luck or divine protection kept him safe when fellow soldiers were falling dead around him. Not a scratch marked Corporal after his passage through British volley fire that should have wounded him even if it did not kill him outright, his complete avoidance of injury seeming impossible to observers familiar with musket fire's effects on infantry formations. British observers write in accounts of engagement that no man could be struck who marched with such confidence, their interpretation of Corporal's survival suggesting that his demeanour somehow protected him, or that his confidence reflected foreknowledge that he would not be hit by defensive fire that was devastating American formation around him. Who marched with such confidence appeared immune to British fire in ways that violated observers' understanding of combat, where courage did not prevent musket balls from striking soldiers who advanced bravely toward enemy positions. British attribution of Corporal's survival to his confident marching reflected their attempt to explain phenomenon that contradicted their combat experience, where volley fire killed or wounded soldiers, regardless of their personal courage or confidence. Write that his survival demonstrated either divine intervention or some quality that made him untouchable when advancing under fire. British observers' accounts trying to rationalize impossible survival through appealing to supernatural explanations, because natural explanations based on probability and chance seemed inadequate for describing how a single soldier could pass through volley fire completely unscathed. Their writing about incident made Corporal famous among both armies as example of soldier who could not be killed by British musketry. British observers' inability to explain Corporal's survival, except through supernatural means, reflected their recognition that his escape from injury contradicted military experience, where volley fire typically inflicted predictable casualties on attacking formations. That no man could be struck was clearly wrong as general principle, given casualties British fire had inflicted on other American soldiers, but Corporal's specific survival seemed to British to require explanation beyond simple luck, because his complete avoidance of injury from hundreds of muskets seemed statistically impossible without supernatural protection. British observers invoked to explain what they had witnessed. The courier who knew woods better than any man alive was used as messenger by Washington during New York retreat, when reliable communication between separated American units was essential for coordinating withdrawal that British forces were attempting to disrupt through intercepting American messengers. His knowledge of terrain allowed him to navigate through British-controlled areas using paths and routes that British patrols did not monitor effectively, making him invaluable for maintaining communication when conventional courier routes were too dangerous for ordinary messengers who lacked his intimate familiarity with woods and terrain. During New York retreat through hostile territory, where British forces controlled most direct routes between American positions, Courier's ability to move unseen through forests and across terrain that British considered impassable made him Washington's preferred messenger for critical communications that could not risk interception. Used as messenger repeatedly because his success rate exceeded other couriers whose unfamiliarity with terrain or whose less developed woodcraft skills made them vulnerable to British patrols that were specifically deployed to intercept American communications. By Washington personally because commanding general recognized that some messages were too important to risk losing through courier's capture, making scouts' reliable delivery record essential for maintaining command coordination during chaotic retreat. During retreat, when American forces were scattered, and when British were attempting to prevent American units from coordinating their withdrawals, courier's ability to deliver messages reliably through British lines made difference between organized retreat and chaotic rout that British were hoping to create through cutting American communications. Better than any man alive was assessment based on courier's repeated successful passages through British-controlled territory when other messengers were being captured or killed, attempting same routes, his survival and mission success suggesting either superior skills or extraordinary luck in navigating hostile territory. Washington's trust in Courier for most critical communications demonstrated confidence in Scout's abilities that was justified through his consistent delivery of messages that maintained American command coordination during dangerous retreat, where communications failures could have been catastrophic for separated American units attempting to withdraw while under British pressure. The ghost of Harlem Heights emerged from British patrols' frustrated reports about Courier, who repeatedly escaped capture despite being cornered in situations where his capture seemed certain to British soldiers who had surrounded his position. British patrols swear he vanished into thin air each time they believed they had trapped him in areas where escape routes appeared to be blocked by British troops positioned to prevent Courier from slipping through their cordon. Each time they cornered him in woods or terrain where British assumed capture was inevitable, Courier disappeared before British could close trap that should have prevented his escape. They cornered him repeatedly according to British patrol reports that described surrounding Courier's position, then discovering he had escaped through routes that British had believed they were monitoring adequately to prevent anyone from passing undetected through their lines. Vanished into thin air was British patrols' explanation for Courier's repeated escapes from situations where they believed capture was certain, their inability to apprehend or even to maintain visual contact with messenger, who seemed to disappear when British attempted to close on his position. Into thin air captured British frustration with Courier, whose escape seemed impossible through conventional means, leading to supernatural explanations for phenomena that was actually result of superior woodcraft and intimate terrain knowledge that allowed Courier to exploit routes and concealment that British patrols did not recognize as viable escape paths. British swearing about Courier's ghost-like qualities reflected their professional embarrassment at repeatedly failing to capture messenger despite having advantages in numbers and despite believing they had surrounded his positions adequately to prevent escape. His reputation as Ghost was tribute to skills that made him effectively impossible for British to capture. Despite their determined efforts to eliminate threat, he represented to their attempts to isolate and destroy separated American units. During New York campaign, when communications were essential for American coordination, and when British were specifically targeting couriers to create confusion among American forces. The commander at Fort Moultrie holds tiny palmetto log fort on Sullivan's Island against devastating naval bombardment in June 1776, when British fleet attempted to force passage into Charleston Harbor by destroying American fortification blocking their approach. A tiny fort constructed from palmetto logs and sand that British naval commanders believed would collapse quickly under sustained bombardment from warships whose heavy guns should have reduced makeshift fortification to rubble within hours of beginning assault. Against naval bombardment from multiple British warships firing simultaneously at American position that defenders had constructed hastily from materials available on Barrier Island protecting Charleston Harbor, Fort's continued resistance surprised British commanders who had anticipated quick reduction of American fortification that appeared inadequate to withstand concentrated naval gunfire. Devastating fire from British fleet represented overwhelming force that should have destroyed American position through sheer weight of metal that British ships could deliver against fixed target, that could not maneuver to avoid. Bombardment. Fort Moultrie's commander refused to surrender, despite British expectations that American garrison would evacuate or surrender, once they recognized futility of resisting naval bombardment that was destroying portions of their fortification. His determination to hold position, demonstrating American willingness to fight despite facing force that seemed capable of destroying fort through sustained shelling. Holds position throughout day-long bombardment that British assumed would force American capitulation within hours, but that instead revealed unexpected resilience of palmetto log construction that absorbed British cannonballs without, shattering like traditional masonry fortifications would have done under similar bombardment. Tiny Fort's resistance frustrated British naval assault on Charleston that was supposed to capture important southern port through combined naval and ground operations. Fort's unexpected resilience forcing British to abandon attempt to force harbour entrance when American defensive fire damaged several British ships, while Fort remained capable of continued resistance despite hours of bombardment that should have eliminated American defensive capability. His flag cannot be shot down became British observation about American colours that remained flying throughout bombardment despite British attempts to destroy flagpole as symbol of American resistance that British wanted to eliminate as demonstration of Fort's defeat. British ships report in after-action accounts that Fort should have collapsed under weight of fire directed against American position, their professional assessment suggesting that fortification constructed from logs and sand should not have withstood sustained naval bombardment that had destroyed portions of Fort without forcing American surrender. Should have collapsed according to British naval officers' expectations based on their experience bombarding fortifications where sustained heavy fire typically reduced defensive works and demoralized defenders sufficiently to force capitulation or evacuation. But Americans could not be made to yield despite bombardment that British believed should have been decisive. American continued resistance, demonstrating determination that British had not anticipated when planning assault on Charleston that was supposed to be relatively straightforward operation against Americans whose defensive capabilities British had underestimated. Could not be made to yield characterized American garrison's stubborn defense that frustrated British expectations and that forced abandonment of Charleston assault when Fort's continued resistance and American defensive fire damaged British ships sufficiently that continuing attack seemed unlikely to succeed without unacceptable losses. British reports emphasized their surprise at American resilience and at fortifications' unexpected ability to withstand bombardment, their accounts making Fort Moultrie defense famous as example of American determination, exceeding what British professional military experience had led them to expect. Flag's survival throughout bombardment became symbol of American defensive success, its continued flying despite British attempts to shoot it down, representing American refusal to surrender, that British found frustrating and impressive simultaneously. British accounts noting Flag's persistence reflected their recognition that American defenders possessed fighting spirit that material circumstances suggested they should have lacked when facing overwhelming British naval superiority. In bombardment that should have forced American capitulation through demonstrating futility of continued resistance against force that Americans could not defeat through return fire alone. The sailor who went overboard by choice was Continental Navy seaman who dives into burning sea during naval engagement to carry messages between ships when conventional communication methods had been disrupted by combat damage to signal systems, and when verbal communication was impossible due to distance and battle noise. By choice, rather than through accident or enemy action, his decision to enter water during active naval combat demonstrated commitment to mission that exceeded normal expectations for sailors whose survival typically depended on remaining aboard ships during battles, when water entry usually meant death through drowning, enemy fire, or exposure. A Continental Navy seaman, whose role was normally confined to ship operations, volunteered for extremely dangerous mission, carrying communications across open water during naval engagement where British and American ships were exchanging. fire at close range, dives into sea that was burning from spilled oil and scattered debris from damaged ships, creating environment where survival seemed impossible to observers, who watched sailor enter water that appeared unsurvivable due to flames and dangerous floating wreckage that could entangle or crush swimmers. To carry messages between ships that could not communicate effectively through conventional signals during engagement, where coordination was essential for American naval operations, but where combat damage had eliminated normal means of inter-ship communication. During naval battle, when British and American vessels were maneuvering in close proximity while exchanging broadsides that created chaos, making conventional communication impossible, sailors' mission was essential for coordinating American tactical responses to British movements. Between ships, separated by hundreds of yards of open water that sailor would need to cross while naval battle continued around him, his swimming would expose him to cannon fire from both sides, to dangerous debris from damaged vessels, and to flames spreading across water's surface from burning oil. By choice to enter this environment demonstrated extraordinary courage or desperate necessity that mission's importance imposed on volunteers willing to risk nearly certain death for sake of maintaining communications that fleet coordination required during critical phase of naval engagement. The ocean wouldn't take him either became explanation for sailors' survival, despite facing multiple lethal threats during his swimming mission between ships engaged in close-range naval combat. Survives cannon fire from British and potentially American ships whose gunners could not easily distinguish between enemy sailors and their own messenger swimming across battle area. His passage through zone of fire, where solid shot and grape shot were filling air, required extraordinary luck or divine protection that witnesses invoked to explain impossible survival. Splinter storms from ships struck by cannon fire created clouds of wooden fragments that killed or wounded sailors through penetrating injuries, making water near engaged vessels particularly dangerous for swimmer exposed to flying debris without protection that ship's structure provided to crews aboard vessels. Drowning currents from ships' wakes and from movements of water displaced by vessels maneuvering during combat created hazards for swimmer whose strength was being exhausted by swimming in heavy clothing while avoiding obstacles and while navigating toward target vessel. And completes mission by reaching intended ship with message intact and by climbing aboard to deliver communication that had been important enough to justify risking his life through swimming across active naval battlefield. His mission completion, despite multiple near-death experiences during crossing, made him famous among Continental Navy crews, whose respect for his courage and for his miraculous survival elevated him to legendary status as sailor who had accomplished impossible feat through combination of skill, determination, and luck that observers could not adequately explain through natural means. Complete's mission successfully demonstrated that extraordinary circumstances sometimes required extraordinary measures that seemed suicidal, but that proved effective when conventional approaches had been eliminated through combat damage or tactical circumstances. Ocean wouldn't take him expressed sailors' belief that he possessed supernatural protection, or that fate had preserved him for reasons that normal probability could not explain. His survival through multiple lethal hazards, seeming to require intervention beyond human capability or ordinary luck, that occasionally preserved individuals through dangerous circumstances. The teenager who defied Tarleton was 14-year-old drummer serving with American forces during Southern Campaign in 1781, when British cavalry under Banastra Tarleton pursued retreating Continental units, attempting to escape engagement that American commanders had decided they could not win through direct combat. Escapes British dragoons who were chasing American stragglers at full speed, their mounted pursuit normally ending in capture or death, for infantry who could not outrun cavalry capable of overtaking fleeing soldiers within minutes of beginning pursuit. British dragoons chasing at full speed represented nearly unavoidable threat to infantrymen on foot, whose running could not match horses' sustained speed over terrain, where cavalry advantages in mobility made escape virtually impossible for soldiers caught in open ground without nearby cover. At full speed when Tarleton's cavalrymen pursued American forces with orders to prevent any Americans from escaping pursuit, that was designed to capture or kill maximum number of retreating soldiers before they could reach safety of American positions or before they could disappear into terrain where cavalry could not follow effectively. A 14-year-old whose physical immaturity should have made him slower and weaker than adult soldiers who were being overtaken by British cavalry, a drummer boy's escape seemed impossible to observers, who watched him outrun pursuers that were catching adult soldiers and that should have captured youth whose lesser strength and shorter stride suggested he would be among first Americans overtaken by charging cavalry. His role as drummer, rather than as combatant, made his presence with retreating forces unusual, most drummers being left behind or surrendering when combat units withdrew under pressure. Who defied Tarleton by escaping pursuit that British cavalry commander had organized specifically to prevent any American soldiers from avoiding capture? Drummer Boy's successful escape frustrated British efforts to destroy American unit completely through pursuing and capturing all soldiers who had survived initial engagement. Defied legendary British cavalry commander, whose reputation for ruthless pursuit made his failure to capture single teenage drummer notable enough that British cavalry officers recorded incident in accounts discussing frustrating aspects of Southern campaign, where Americans sometimes escaped despite British advantages in mobility and tactical position. The devil himself could not catch him, was British cavalry officers' assessment of Drummer Boy, whose escape from Tarleton's dragoons seemed to defy natural laws about relative speeds of horses and running humans. British cavalry officers note teenagers' impossible stamina that allowed him to maintain speed exceeding what they believed 14-year-olds should possess when running for extended distance while being pursued by mounted troops whose horses should have closed distance within minutes of beginning chase. Impossible stamina and agility that Drummer demonstrated through maintaining pace that prevented cavalry from catching him, despite their sustained pursuit over terrain where cavalry normally overtook infantry easily, his performance suggesting either extraordinary physical capabilities or supernatural assistance that British officers invoked to explain escape that contradicted their experience. Note his survival in official reports and in personal correspondence, where British cavalry officers discussed remarkable incidents from Southern campaign. Drummer Boy's escape, becoming example of American determination and physical capability that British found impressive, despite their frustration at failing to capture him. Agility in changing direction and in exploiting terrain features that horses could not navigate as easily as running human demonstrated tactical intelligence beyond what British expected from 14-year-old Drummer, his evasive maneuvers prolonging chase until he reached terrain where cavalry could not follow, or until exhaustion of British horses forced them to abandon pursuit. British attribution of demonic qualities to Drummer reflected their attempt to rationalize failure to capture youth who should have been easy prey for experienced cavalrymen riding superior mounts. Could not catch him despite their professional expertise in cavalry pursuit and despite horses' natural advantages over human runner. British officers' admission of failure to capture single teenage Drummer revealed their grudging respect for American, whose escape they could not adequately explain through normal analysis of pursuit tactics and relative capabilities, of cavalry versus infantry. Devil himself was hyperbolic expression, capturing British frustration with Drummer whose escape seemed to mock their professional competence and whose survival demonstrated that even young Americans possessed fighting spirit and physical capabilities that British had not anticipated when planning campaigns they expected to win through superior training and mobility. Captured at Brooklyn Heights in August 1776, when British forces overran American defensive positions, Soldier was bayoneted, beaten, and left in pile of bodies after British assumed he was dead or dying from wounds he had received during fighting. Bayoneted multiple times during British assault that killed hundreds of Americans who could not escape encirclement, his wounds should have been fatal or at least incapacitating enough to prevent movement or escape from battlefield, where British were collecting prisoners and where wounded who could not move were being left to die. Beaten by British soldiers after his initial wounding to additional trauma that should have ensured his death through combination of bayonet wounds and blunt force injuries that together created damage that medical knowledge of era considered unsurvivable without immediate professional treatment. left in pile of bodies where British had stacked dead and dying Americans for later burial. His placement among corpses indicated British assessment that he would not survive long enough to justify taking him prisoner or providing medical attention that British reserved for soldiers whose survival seemed possible. In pile of bodies overnight where he remained unconscious or too weak to move while British secured battlefield, and while other wounded Americans either died from their injuries or were discovered and taken prisoner if British determined. They might survive captivity. Bayoneted soldiers rarely survived multiple wounds because blood loss, shock, and infection typically killed them within hours or days, even if individual wounds were not immediately fatal, making his survival through night particularly remarkable to those who later learned of his escape. And left assumption by British that he was dead or would die soon from wounds that appeared fatal based on blood loss and on lack of movement that suggested he was already dead when placed in pile with other casualties. British forces moving on to other tasks after initial battlefield clearing meant that no one was monitoring pile of bodies where he lay among dead comrades, creating opportunity for escape if he regained consciousness and possessed strength to move despite wounds that should have prevented any physical activity. Rises at dawn after surviving night among corpses, where cold temperatures may have slowed blood loss and where unconsciousness may have allowed body to preserve energy that conscious suffering would have consumed. His survival through critical hours, when most bayonet victims died from shock or blood loss, seemed miraculous to those who later heard his story. And walks away from pile of bodies where British had left him to die. His movement, despite multiple bayonet wounds and beating stunning both himself and British soldiers, who observed him stumbling across battlefield toward American lines that were miles distant. Stuns British soldiers who witness his movement because they had assumed that anyone in pile of bodies was dead or dying, his walking demonstrating impossible vitality that contradicted their assessment of wounds he had received during previous days' fighting. By stumbling back toward American positions that he could see in distance, his direction and purpose, indicating that he retained enough consciousness and strength to navigate, despite injuries that should have left him unable to move or think clearly. Back to American lines over miles of ground that he crossed slowly due to weakness from blood loss and from injuries that made each step painful, his journey taking hours during which British could have recaptured him, but apparently allowed him to continue from mixture of amazement at his survival and respect for determination that kept him moving despite wounds. Still alive when reaching American positions where sentries initially could not believe he had survived bayoneting and night among corpses, his arrival providing evidence that some Americans could survive injuries that normally proved fatal when victims received immediate medical attention that he had not possessed during critical hours after wounding. Walks away from death that British had assumed was certain, his survival and escape demonstrating extraordinary resilience or luck that medical understanding could not adequately explain when examining wounds that should have killed him. British soldiers' astonishment at seeing him moving reflected their recognition that his survival contradicted everything military medicine knew about bayonet wounds' typical progression, making his escape from pile of bodies and his successful return to American lines a legendary example of soldier who refused to die despite receiving injuries that killed most men receiving similar wounds during Brooklyn Heights battle. The wound that should have ended him was musket ball through upper arm that shattered bone and severed muscles, leaving Sergeant with arm that hung useless and that caused constant pain throughout remainder of his service. Shot through upper arm during engagement where American and British forces exchanged fire at close range. His wound was typical combat injury that normally ended soldiers' military service because damage to arm prevented them from loading and firing muskets that required 2 functional arms for operation, according to standard infantry. Drill is less than #0. 9 is greater than losing almost all use of wounded arm that could not grip objects or support weight. Sergeant faced discharge from continental service because military regulations assumed that soldiers needed 2 functional arms for performing infantry duties. His wound's severity made normal musket operation impossible through conventional methods that required both hands for loading powder and ball, ramming charge, and aiming weapon while supporting its weight during firing sequence that standard drill manual prescribed. Almost all use meant that arm retained minimal function insufficient for normal activities, but apparently enough that Sargent believed he could continue serving if he could develop method for operating musket with only one fully functional arm. Should have ended his military service, according to military medical practice that typically discharged soldiers whose wounds prevented them from performing standard infantry duties, as described in drill manuals that assumed all soldiers possessed two working arms. Him as soldier, according to conventional military wisdom that saw seriously wounded men as liabilities rather than as continuing contributors to military operations, Sargent's determination to remain in service despite wound that ended most soldiers' military careers demonstrated commitment exceeding what Continental Army could reasonably expect from volunteers whose service was voluntary, and who had legitimate reasons for seeking discharge when wounds made continued service extremely difficult. Upper arm injury was serious wound that typically resulted in medical discharge or in reassignment to non-combat duties that wounded soldiers could perform without requiring two functional arms for musket operation. He ties his musket to his shoulder using leather straps and cord that allowed him to support weapon's weight without using wounded arm that could not bear loads or grip musket stock firmly, and keeps fighting despite disability that would have ended most soldiers' combat service. His improvised method for musket operation allowing him to continue performing infantry duties that regulations assumed required two functional arms. Keeps fighting through developing technique for loading and firing musket using only one arm, supplemented by straps that secured weapon to his body, his innovation demonstrating that standard military procedures could be adapted by determined soldiers whose wounds prevented conventional weapon operation. His method was slower than normal loading sequence, but was effective enough that he could maintain place in firing line and could contribute firepower that Continental Army desperately needed from every soldier capable of shooting, regardless of disabilities that might have ended their service under stricter enforcement of medical discharge policies. Even British officers admire his ingenuity after observing American Sargent continuing to fight despite obvious disability that they could see from his arms' useless hanging and from unusual way he operated musket using straps and single-arm technique, calling him Ghost with broken arm because his continued presence in combat contradicted British expectations that seriously wounded soldiers would be evacuated or discharged rather than remaining in line to fight. Ghost reference, suggesting supernatural determination required for continuing service, despite injury that should have ended military career. With broken arm, whose damage was visible to observers who witnessed his unusual musket operation, Sargent became famous among both armies as example of soldier who refused to accept that wounds should end his service. British officers' admiration reflected their professional respect for determination that overcame disability through ingenuity, creating new method for weapon operation. Their accounts making Sargent legendary as American, who literally tied himself to continued fighting, rather than accepting discharge that regulations would have justified based on severity of wounds he had sustained and based on resulting disability that prevented normal musket operation. The woodsman from northern frontier was towering axe-wielding fighter whose physical size and strength distinguished him from typical continental soldiers whose average height and build made them less imposing than frontiersmen whose the life of heavy labor had developed musculature and endurance exceeding what most soldiers possessed. A towering presence whose height and build made him visible in combat formations, where most soldiers were shorter and slighter. His physical advantages in reach and strength made him formidable opponent in close combat, where size mattered for wielding heavy weapons and for overpowering enemies in hand-to-hand fighting. Axe-wielding fighter who preferred his familiar frontier tool to musket and bayonet that most infantry carried. His weapon choice reflected background in logging and wilderness survival, where axe was essential tool that frontiersmen used daily and that they could wield with skill, exceeding what training with military weapons typically produced. Who refuses to wait for orders during engagement where American forces were under pressure? His independent action demonstrated frontier individualism that sometimes conflicted with military discipline, requiring soldiers to act in coordination rather than initiating individual actions without authorization from officers. refuses to wait when he saw opportunity for action that military hierarchy's slow decision-making process might have missed or might have rejected as too risky. His frontier experience teaching him to act decisively when circumstances favored bold moves, rather than waiting for permission that might arrive too late. For orders that would have required him to remain in formation while officers decided whether circumstances justified counterattack or aggressive defense, Woodsman's refusal to wait reflected confidence in his own judgment and in his physical capabilities that made individual actions seem more effective than coordinated unit movements that doctrine prescribed. From northern frontier, where independence and self-reliance were survival necessities and where waiting for group consensus could mean death, Woodsman brought tactical approach, emphasizing individual initiative over collective discipline. His background made him natural fighter, whose instincts about when to attack or defend were based on years of wilderness experience, where correct decisions meant survival and where incorrect choices meant death from wildlife, weather, or hostile humans encountered in frontier regions, where formal authority was absent and where survival depended on personal capabilities rather than on institutional support. The moment British thought they saw myth occurred when Woodsman charged alone into British light infantry formation that was preparing to assault American positions. His solitary attack seeming suicidal to observers who understood that individual soldier attacking formation of professional infantry should have been killed immediately by coordinated British response. Charges alone, without waiting for supporting troops or for orders authorizing assault, his independent action violating military doctrine that emphasized coordinated attacks rather than individual initiatives that exposed single soldiers to concentrated enemy fire without support that might have divided British attention. Shattering light infantry formation through physical presence and through axe-wielding that created casualties and confusion among British soldiers who had not expected single American to attack their formed unit aggressively, his assault disrupting British cohesion long enough for Americans to benefit from momentary confusion. Long enough for Americans to retreat because Woodsman's attack drew British attention and because his presence in their formation forced British to respond to immediate threat rather than pursuing Americans who were withdrawing from engagement they could not win. For Americans to retreat safely from engagement that British light infantry had been threatening to turn into rout through aggressive pursuit, Woodsman's sacrifice of his advanced position bought time that allowed American forces to establish defensive line or to increase distance from British pursuers. British thought they saw myth because frontiersmen's size, aggressive action, and apparent imperviousness to danger resembled legendary warriors from folklore rather than actual human soldiers whose behavior normally reflected rational calculations about survival rather than reckless charges into enemy formations. Saw myth in flesh when towering axe-wielding American charged their formation alone and scattered experienced light infantry through sheer audacity and physical prowess that British had not encountered previously from continental soldiers. His action seemed impossible by conventional military logic that said individual soldiers could not break formed units through solo attacks, making British interpret Woodsman as something beyond normal human soldier, perhaps mythical warrior who could not be killed by conventional means, or perhaps American who possessed physical capabilities and courage exceeding what British fighter, professional soldiers, typically encountered in combat against continental forces. The musket ball that should have killed him struck Private's forehead at close range during firefight, where British and American forces were exchanging volleys at distances where musket balls retained lethal velocity and where head wounds typically proved instantly fatal, or at least incapacitating. A British musket ball hits his forehead, producing wound that witnesses expected would kill him immediately, because head wounds from musket fire normally caused fatal brain damage, even when projectiles did not penetrate skull completely, shock and trauma from impact being sufficient to cause death. At close range, when fired with full powder charge, providing maximum velocity to musket ball that struck forehead with force that should have penetrated bone and entered brain, killing instantly or within minutes through brain damage and shock. his forehead taking direct hit from musket ball that British soldier had aimed and fired at torso or head in attempt to kill American, whose proximity made missing difficult for even inexperienced shooter. Close range, ensuring that musket ball retained energy necessary for penetrating flesh and bone, rather than merely causing surface wounds that long-range musket fire sometimes produced. That should have killed him outright, according to military medical knowledge that recognized head wounds as typically fatal when projectiles struck skull with force sufficient to fracture bone or penetrate into brain. His survival after such wound seeming impossible to witnesses who saw him fall and who assumed he was dead from wound that normally ended life instantly. Should have killed him based on every precedent from military medical practice treating musket wounds where head injuries almost always proved fatal, either immediately or within hours through swelling and infection that secondary. Treatments could not prevent effectively. Him immediately was expectation of British soldiers who had shot him, and of American soldiers who witnessed his wounding, their experience with combat injuries teaching them that head wounds from musket fire at close range meant certain death for victims who might survive other wounds with proper medical treatment. At close range, ensuring that musket ball possessed kinetic energy for penetrating skull, his survival of such wound contradicted everything witnesses understood about musket wounds' effects on human bodies and about medical prognosis for soldiers receiving head injuries during combat. The skull too thick to crack became explanation for Private's survival after musket ball struck his forehead without penetrating bone, despite hitting with force that should have fractured skull and entered brain. His unusually thick skull bone, apparently deflecting projectile that would have killed most men receiving similar wounds. British surgeons write about him with astonishment in medical reports, documenting unusual combat injuries they had treated or observed, his case becoming medical curiosity where musket ball had struck skull directly without causing fatal penetration that such wounds normally produced. Write about him as exceptional case where skull thickness exceeded normal range sufficiently to prevent musket ball penetration that would have been fatal for soldiers with typical bone density. British medical officers' documentation of unusual injury making Private famous among military surgeons who discussed remarkable survivals they had witnessed. With astonishment at wound's appearance suggesting fatal injury, but examination revealing that skull had not been penetrated, despite musket ball's impact, creating visible damage to forehead where projectile had struck. He's walking within hour of receiving wound that should have left him unconscious or dead. His rapid recovery surprising British medical officers who had examined him, expecting to find dying man, but discovering instead that he had suffered severe concussion and scalp wound without brain damage that musket ball would have caused, if it had penetrated skull. Within hour, when most head wound victims were unconscious or dying from brain trauma, his mobility and consciousness demonstrated that wound was not as serious as its appearance and circumstances suggested. Too thick to crack, literally in sense that musket ball had failed to fracture bone despite striking with force that normally shattered skulls, his survival resulting from anatomical peculiarity that military surgeons had rarely encountered in treating thousands of combat wounds. British surgeons' reports about Private whose skull resisted musket ball penetration made him legendary among medical officers who collected accounts of unusual injuries and improbable survivals that defied normal medical expectations. About combat wounds' effects on human bodies, his case becoming textbook example of how individual anatomical variations could determine survival, when injuries that killed most men were survived by individuals whose bodies deviated from normal ranges in ways that provided unexpected protection. The men who refused to die were not invincible in sense of being immune to injury or death that claimed thousands of their comrades during Revolutionary War's 8 years of fighting. They weren't invincible, but were combination of determined soldiers who refused to surrender or to accept that wounds should end their service, lucky individuals whose survival through seemingly fatal circumstances defied probability, furious fighters whose anger at British oppression drove them to continue fighting despite injuries or tactical situations that justified retreat, and skilled combatants whose abilities in marksmanship or in close combat gave them advantages that kept them alive when less capable soldiers died. Determined soldiers maintained fighting spirit despite wounds, exhaustion, and tactical circumstances that would have broken less committed men, their refusal to quit demonstrating psychological resilience that military training alone could not instill. Lucky survivors whose escapes from death seemed miraculous to witnesses benefited from chance factors that allowed them to survive wounds or combat situations that killed most soldiers facing similar circumstances, their survival owing more to probability than to supernatural intervention that contemporaries sometimes invoked to explain impossible survivals. British didn't fear American numbers that were typically inferior to British forces deployed in major engagements, didn't fear American training that was inadequate compared to British professional preparation, didn't fear American equipment that was often inferior to British weapons and supplies. They feared Americans' refusal to fall when wounded, to surrender when surrounded, to accept defeat when losing battles, psychological factor that made Americans dangerous opponents, despite material disadvantages that should have guaranteed British victory in conventional military calculations. Refusal to fall characterized American fighting spirit that British found frustrating and that made suppressing rebellion more difficult than British strategic planning had anticipated. Americans' determination to continue resisting despite defeats and hardships, eventually exhausting British will to continue war, whose costs exceeded benefits that victory would provide. These 11 legends represented hundreds of similar cases where individual Americans survived impossible circumstances through determination, luck, skill, or fury that kept them fighting when rational calculation suggested they should surrender or die quietly. Their collective refusal to accept defeat, making American independence achievable despite British military superiority that conventional analysis suggested should have crushed rebellion quickly. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.